The transformation of lead into gold stands as one of humanity's most enduring symbols, yet its deepest significance has been systematically misunderstood by those who approach it with literal eyes. This misunderstanding is not accidental but essential to the work itself, for the alchemical process begins not in the crucible of metals, but in the confrontation with one's fundamental ignorance. The seeker who arrives at the threshold of alchemy, carrying dreams of material wealth, has already failed the first test, revealing themselves unprepared for the psychological ordeal that authentic transformation demands. The historical lineage of this sacred science traces itself through a constellation of brilliant minds who understood that the great work operates upon consciousness itself. Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical fusion of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes, established the foundational axiom, as above, so below, as within, so without. This principle is not mystical poetry but operational psychology, indicating that the microcosm of human consciousness mirrors the macrocosm of universal processes. Paracelsus, the revolutionary physician-alchemist of the Renaissance, insisted that true medicine healed not merely the body but the entire being, recognizing that physical illness manifested psychological and spiritual discord. His doctrine of the three principles, salt, sulfur, and mercury described not chemical substances but fundamental aspects of existence operating simultaneously in matter, soul, and spirit. Carl Jung, perhaps the greatest modern interpreter of alchemical symbolism, recognized in these ancient texts a sophisticated map of psychological integration. His analysis revealed that the alchemists projected their unconscious processes onto matter, engaging in what he termed active imagination through laboratory work. The Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo, the blackening, whitening, and reddening corresponded precisely to psychological stages of confronting the shadow, purifying consciousness, and achieving individuation. Eliphas Levi, the 19th century occultist who resurrected Western esoteric traditions from Enlightenment dismissal, emphasized that magical operations required not supernatural intervention, but trained will operating through natural laws not yet understood by materialist science. The premise establishes itself with uncompromising clarity. The gold of which the alchemist spoke represents the perfected self, the integrated personality that has undergone conscious refinement. The lead is the raw, unexamined existence most humans accept as their permanent condition. The process of transmutation is psychological, spiritual, and profoundly difficult, requiring years of disciplined work upon one's own consciousness. This is not self-help optimism or therapeutic adjustment to social norms. It is radical transformation of the fundamental structures through which one experiences reality itself. The alchemical system operates through a precise architecture of correspondence, each element supporting and necessitating the others in a structure of remarkable coherence. At its foundation lie the three principles, sulfur, mercury, and salt. These are not the chemical elements bearing these names, but fundamental qualities pervading all existence. Sulfur represents the fiery, active principle consciousness, will, and the individualizing force that creates identity. Mercury embodies fluidity, transformation, and mediation, the psychological flexibility required for change, a capacity to dissolve fixed patterns and reform them. Salt provides stability, crystallization, and embodiment, the grounding principle that prevents dissolution into mere potentiality, anchoring consciousness in manifest reality. These three principles operate within the framework of the four classical elements: fire, water, air, and earth creating a matrix of 12 basic combinations that describe all possible states of consciousness and matter. Fire and sulfur combine in willful action, water and mercury in emotional fluidity, earth and salt in material manifestation, air and mercury in intellectual comprehension. The sophisticated practitioner recognizes these not as metaphors, but as operational categories through which experience can be analyzed and transformed. When Jung described the functions of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, he was rediscovering in psychological language what the alchemists had codified in elemental symbolism. The connection to Kabbalistic doctrine becomes evident in the alchemical emphasis on stages of manifestation. The Kabbalistic tree of life describes 10 emanations through which the infinite contracts into finite form, paralleling the alchemical sequence from prima materia undifferentiated potential through increasingly refined states to the philosopher's stone. The Sephiroth of Keter, Chokmah, and Bina correspond to the alchemical trinity of principles. The lower Sephiroth to stages of material and psychological crystallization. Both systems recognize that creation and consciousness operate through hierarchical levels, each more condensed and limited than the previous, requiring systematic work to ascend through increasingly subtle awareness. Neoplatonist philosophy provides the metaphysical foundation for alchemical practice. Plotinus established that reality emanates from the one through successive levels of being, the intellect, the soul, and finally matter. The alchemical work reverses this emanation, refining matter back toward its spiritual source. This is not escape from materiality, but its conscious elevation, matter becoming transparent to spirit through human work. The Rosicrucian tradition synthesized these streams, adding Christian symbolism to Hermetic foundations, emphasizing that spiritual resurrection required literal death of the old self, not metaphorical death but genuine, psychological dissolution. The mentality required for this work differs categorically from ordinary consciousness. The adept must cultivate what Aleister Crowley termed true will, not egoic desire, but alignment with one's deepest purpose, discovered through eliminating false identifications. This requires brutal honesty about one's actual motivations, a willingness to observe oneself without the comforting lies that sustain ordinary life. The ethical foundation is not conventional morality, but integrity in the original sense, becoming whole, integrated, undivided. This often requires violating social norms when those norms serve collective neurosis rather than individual truth. Doubt serves as essential instrument, not obstacle. The occultist embraces skepticism toward all claims, including one's own experiences, recognizing that self-deception operates most powerfully when one believes oneself enlightened. This disciplined doubt differs from cynical dismissal. It is methodological rigor applied to internal states. The alchemist tests each realization against experience, discards what proves illusory, retains what withstands examination. This process can take decades, requiring patience that modern culture systematically destroys through its addiction to immediate results. The alchemical opus unfolds through distinct stages, each characterized by specific psychological operations and symbolic imagery. Understanding these stages requires recognizing them as descriptions of actual internal experiences, not theoretical constructs. The adept who undertakes this work will encounter these phases in direct, often overwhelming intensity. The work begins with calcination, the burning away of superficial identifications. The practitioner confronts the fact that everything they believe themselves to be, their social roles, their self-image, Their cherished beliefs are constructions, defenses against the void at the core of unexamined existence. This is not intellectual understanding, but visceral realization. The initial calcination often arrives through crisis, the collapse of a relationship, career failure, confrontation with mortality, or simply the accumulation of existential anxiety that can no longer be suppressed through distraction. Jung recognized this as the encounter with the shadow, those aspects of oneself that consciousness has rejected as incompatible with the ego's self-concept. The shadow contains not only negative qualities like aggression, selfishness, and desire, but also repressed potential, vitality that was suppressed to maintain social acceptability. The alchemical texts depict this stage through imagery of putrefaction, decomposition, the black crow or raven, the death's head. These are not metaphors, but accurate descriptions of how consciousness experiences its own dissolution. The practitioner feels themselves rotting, becoming disgusting, losing all value. Depression in this context is not pathology, but necessary operation. The psychological mechanism involves systematic dismantling of defensive structures. Every rationalization, every self-justification must be examined and recognized as defensive maneuvering. This requires witnessing oneself with cold honesty, observing how one manipulates situations to maintain preferred self-image, how one projects blame, how one constructs elaborate narratives to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The work is exhausting, nauseating, seemingly endless. Many abandon the process here, concluding that psychological exploration leads only to misery, fleeing back to the comfortable numbness of conventional life. Dissolution follows calcination, where burning reduced the false self to ash. Dissolution now washes away even the ash, leaving nothing solid to grasp. In psychological terms, this is the flooding of consciousness with unconscious content. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions surge without clear cause. Long-buried memories surface. The neat categories through which one organized experience break down. The ego, that center of consciousness which believed itself autonomous and in control, discovers itself to be a small structure floating on vast depths it neither created nor controls. The alchemical water in this stage represents the unconscious itself. That which flows, cannot be grasped, dissolves boundaries. The practitioner experiences themselves as drowning, identity liquefying. This state, if prolonged without proper containment, resembles psychosis. The boundaries between self and other, inner and outer, past and present become permeable. This is why traditional systems insisted on gradual initiation under experienced guidance. The modern individual attempting this work in isolation risks genuine psychological disintegration. From the dissolved mass, separation extracts what is valuable from what must be discarded. This stage requires brutal discrimination, distinguishing authentic insight from comforting illusion, genuine transformation from mere ego inflation, spiritual experience from psychological dramatization. The alchemical imagery shows the separation of elements, the ego rising from the putrefied matter, the winnowing of grain from chaff, the distillation that separates subtle essence from gross residue. Psychologically, this involves developing what Jung termed the observing ego, a capacity to witness one's own processes without immediate identification. The practitioner learns to notice thoughts arising and passing without believing every thought to be true or important. Emotions are felt fully but not confused with reality. One can be angry without believing anger justifies action. afraid without believing fear accurately assesses danger. This is not dissociation, but conscious differentiation, cultivating what Buddhism terms mindfulness and Western psychology inadequately labels metacognition. The danger in this stage is premature transcendence, believing oneself above the material one has supposedly separated from. The ego, threatened by dissolution, often constructs a spiritual ego that identifies with the observer position, claiming enlightenment while merely establishing a new defensive structure. Genuine separation is humble, recognizing that what is observed remains part of oneself, that the observer is not separate from the observed but a function of the same consciousness. The separated elements must be reunited, but now consciously, rather than in their original unconscious fusion. Alchemically, this is the chemical wedding, the sacred marriage of opposites, king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. Psychologically, it represents the integration of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, not through suppression of one by the other, but through their mutual recognition and cooperation. Jung described this as the integration of the anima in men and animus in women, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche that mediate between consciousness and the unconscious. A man must consciously relate to the feminine within himself, not by becoming effeminate, but by acknowledging receptivity, emotion. Relationship is equally valid to his conscious identification with agency and rationality. A woman must acknowledge her capacity for directed action, analysis, and discrimination without believing this makes her less feminine. These are not gender stereotypes, but psychological structures operating in all human consciousness, regardless of biological sex or chosen identity. The conjunction produces what alchemists call the rebus or hermaphrodite, not a literal androgen, but a consciousness that has internalized both poles and can flexibly employ either as circumstances require. This is psychological maturity, the capacity to be strong without rigidity, receptive without passivity, discriminating without cruelty, compassionate without sentimentality. Most people remain identified with one pole, compulsively enacting it while projecting its opposite onto others, then wondering why their relationships inevitably fail. The work continues through fermentation, the introduction of living spirit into the purified matter. Alchemically, this stage involves adding specific substances that catalyze transformation. Psychologically, it represents the infusion of meaning and vitality into the integrated structure created through previous stages. Without fermentation, conjunction produces only a sterile union, psychologically healthy perhaps, but lifeless, lacking the animating force that makes existence worth living. This stage often involves what religious traditions term grace or inspiration, something that cannot be forced but must be received. The practitioner has done everything possible through will and work. Now they must open to what transcends personal effort. This is not passivity, but receptivity, the cultivation of a space within consciousness that can receive what Jung termed the self, the archetype of wholeness, and the central organizing principle of the psyche. The imagery shifts from death and dissolution to germination and growth. The philosophical tree appears, the plant that grows from the corpse of the old self, drawing nourishment from decay to produce new life. Dreams in this period often feature gardens, springs, flowering trees, young animals, symbols of renewed vitality. The practitioner experiences themselves coming back to life, but now consciously, deliberately, with understanding of what they are and what they are doing. Repeated refinement follows, distilling increasingly subtle essences. Each circulation through the alchemical vessel removes more impurity, produces greater clarity. Psychologically, this is the ongoing work of maintaining consciousness against a constant tendency toward mechanical reaction, unconscious identification, regression to old patterns. The practitioner must repeatedly recognize and release attachments, again and again, discovering that what seemed final transformation was merely another stage requiring further work. This stage teaches humility. Every realization, no matter how profound, becomes another structure that consciousness can identify with, creating new rigidity, requiring dissolution. The mature practitioner recognizes that the work never ends, that vigilance and effort must be sustained indefinitely. This is not discouraging, but liberating. One need not achieve perfection, only maintain direction, continuing the work regardless of setbacks or apparent failures. Finally, the work culminates in coagulation, the production of the philosopher's stone, the rubedo or reddening, the solar gold that results from perfecting the lunar silver. Psychologically, this represents what Jung termed individuation, the achievement of a stable, integrated personality that has incorporated both conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, human and divine aspects into functional unity. The Rubedo consciousness operates from center, unmoved by circumstances while fully engaged with them. This is not detachment, but non-attachment, caring deeply while not being ruled by results, acting with full commitment while recognizing the relative nature of all achievement. The individual has become transparent to archetypal energies while remaining grounded in personal existence. They can employ persona appropriately without identification, relate to others without projection, pursue goals without neurotic compulsion. This stage is not permanent acquisition, but dynamic achievement requiring constant maintenance. The philosopher's stone must be created anew each day through continued practice. The integrated individual has not transcended human limitation, but learned to work skillfully within it, accepting mortality, embracing uncertainty, finding meaning not in achievement, but in the quality of consciousness brought to each moment. The most critical phase of alchemical transformation occurs in the depths of the Nigredo, particularly during what mystical traditions term the dark night of the soul. This is not poetic exaggeration, but precise description of a psychological state that must be traversed for authentic transformation to occur. The crisis distinguishes genuine initiatory experience from mere therapeutic adjustment or spiritual bypassing. The nature of this crisis involves the complete collapse of meaning-making structure. Everything that previously provided purpose, value, or direction reveals itself as arbitrary construction. Relationships appear as mutual exploitation, career as prostitution of one's life force for survival, spiritual beliefs as comforting fantasies, even one's own efforts at transformation as elaborate ego games. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may appear clinically identical, but metaphysical recognition of the void underlying all human projects. The alchemical texts describe this as the blackest black, the massa confusa, the prima materia in its most resistant state. Psychologically, the practitioner experiences themselves as fundamentally defective, irredeemably corrupt, incapable of genuine change. Every past failure returns with crushing force. Every cruelty committed or received, every moment of cowardice or betrayal, the entire accumulated weight of one's existence becomes unbearable. Sleep becomes difficult or excessive. Appetite disappears or becomes compulsive. The body itself seems to rebel against continued existence. What distinguishes this crisis from pathological depression is its teleological nature. It serves a purpose in the overall arc of transformation. Clinical depression typically involves regression to earlier developmental stages, fixation on past trauma, a closing down of possibilities. The alchemical crisis, by contrast, involves facing forward into the void, recognizing that all structures are temporary, that security is illusion, that death will annihilate everything one has built. This recognition is accurate, not distorted. The error lies not in the perception, but in the previous belief that life should be otherwise. The confrontation with the shadow reaches its zenith here. One recognizes not merely personal flaws, but the fundamental human capacity for evil. The respectable citizen discovers within themselves the potential for murder. The loving parent recognizes the impulse toward cruelty. The spiritual seeker acknowledges the pleasure taken in others' suffering. These are not aberrations, but human possibilities present in all consciousness, usually suppressed through identification with flattering self-concept. Jung insisted that acknowledging one's shadow prevented its unconscious acting out. Only by accepting one's capacity for evil can one consciously choose otherwise. The philosophical distinction between this initiatory crisis and modern pathology lies in containment and direction. Traditional systems provided ritual structure, mythological frameworks, and experienced guides to contextualize the experience. The initiate understood their ordeal as temporary and purposeful, a stage in a larger process. Modern individuals, lacking such context, often experience identical psychological states as meaningless suffering, requiring elimination through medication or hospitalization. Both approaches have validity. Genuine pathology requires medical treatment, but conflating the two categories prevents understanding that some psychological suffering is necessary and productive. The temptation towards suicide in this stage is not psychiatric symptom, but philosophical question. Why continue? If meaning is constructed, if values are arbitrary, if death ends all, why not accelerate the inevitable? The alchemists understood this temptation symbolically. The death of the old self must be total, not metaphorical. One cannot carry anything from the previous identity into the new. This requires a kind of suicide, but psychological rather than physical. The practitioner must die to who they were while remaining embodied, navigating the paradox of conscious death. This impossibility creates the transformative tension. One cannot will oneself through this stage. Will itself has dissolved. One cannot think through it. Conceptual understanding is useless. One can only endure, maintaining minimal function, while the old structures complete their decomposition. This endurance without hope or purpose is itself the operation. The practitioner learns that they are not their thoughts, emotions, or circumstances, because all of these have proven unstable, while something consciousness itself continues witnessing. The emergence from this crisis does not happen through insight or effort, but through exhaustion. The psychological structures that were decomposing complete their process. What remains is simpler, more essential. The practitioner discovers they are still alive, still conscious, but fundamentally changed. They have touched bottom and found it bearable. This knowledge that one can survive total psychological death provides unshakable foundation for subsequent work. The philosopher's stone represents not a static achievement, but a new mode of being in the world. The individual who has completed the great work, or more accurately, who is committed to its ongoing practice, for the work is never truly complete, operates from transformed consciousness, characterized by several distinct qualities. First, there is radical acceptance of what is, without resignation to what might be. The integrated individual clearly perceives reality without the distorting filters of wishful thinking, defensive projection, or neurotic compensation. This creates a quality of presence that others often experience as disturbing. Here is someone not lost in psychological drama, not manipulating for advantage, not performing identity for approval. Such presence exposes others' inauthenticity through mere contrast, often provoking hostility from those still identified with defensive structure. Second, the capacity for conscious action replaces mechanical reaction. The integrated individual responds to circumstances from center, having incorporated rather than suppressed instinctual drives. Their actions arise from understanding rather than compulsion, chosen rather than automatic. This does not mean they never experience anger, fear, or desire. These remain part of human experience, but they are not ruled by such reaction, can employ them skillfully when appropriate and release them when not. Third, there is fundamental ethical transformation, though not necessarily in conventional terms. The individual who has confronted their own shadow, acknowledged their capacity for evil, and chosen consciousness despite its burden operates from genuine morality rather than social conditioning. Their ethics arise not from fear of punishment or desire for approval, but from recognition of interconnection. Having integrated the personal and collective unconscious, they experience others' suffering as continuous with their own, making unnecessary cruelty psychologically impossible, not through repression, but through immediate empathy. The practical applications for modern life are precise and demanding. The integrated individual maintains consciousness in circumstances where others operate automatically. In conflict, they recognize projection and respond to underlying needs rather than surface demands. In work, they identify meaningful contribution rather than pursuing status or security. In relationship, they offer genuine presence rather than performing roles. This sounds admirable in theory, but is often exhausting in practice, requiring constant effort while appearing effortless to observers. The moral responsibility accompanying this transformation is considerable. Knowledge of psychological operations creates obligation toward those still suffering unconscious identification. The integrated individual cannot pretend ignorance of human possibility, cannot simply pursue personal pleasure or security while possessing means to alleviate others' suffering. This does not require missionary zeal attempts to force transformation on the unwilling or counterproductive, but it does demand authentic teaching for those genuinely seeking, embodying the possibility of conscious living as example rather than prescription. The work of the Hermetic school serves precisely this function, maintaining rigorous standards against the degradation of esoteric knowledge into New Age consolation, providing authentic maps of consciousness transformation for serious practitioners, and demonstrating through analytical precision that these ancient teachings address real psychological operations rather than comforting fantasy. The discipline required studying original text, practicing sustained attention, embracing rather than avoiding difficulty creates the container within which transformation becomes possible. The individual who completes this journey more accurately, who has progressed sufficiently to recognize the journey's continuation, discovers that the gold they have produced is themselves consciousness refined through deliberate effort into instrument capable of perceiving and operating upon reality with unprecedented clarity. They have become the philosopher's stone, agent of transformation in the world not through magical powers, but through lucid presence. Their existence demonstrates what human consciousness can achieve when freed from identification with arbitrary limitations, when disciplined through systematic practice, when committed to truth regardless of personal cost. This is not superhuman achievement, but the realization of authentic human potential, the completion of the developmental trajectory that most abort through fear, distraction, or misunderstanding. Every human possesses the raw material, the lead of unexamined existence. The question is whether one will accept the demanding work of refinement or remain satisfied with base metal, never discovering the gold that lies dormant within. The gold you seek does not lie in the crucible, awaiting discovery through proper technique or secret formula. It exists as potential within the consciousness that seeks it, requiring not revelation, but systematic work upon one's own being. The fire that transforms lead into gold burns, not in the laboratory, but in the disciplined attention brought to each moment of existence, the will to remain conscious despite the seductive pull of mechanical sleep. The true alchemist recognizes that they are simultaneously the base matter requiring purification, the operator conducting the work, and the refined product emerging from sustained effort. The great work is not completed but undertaken, renewed each day through the choice to live conscious rather than drift through life in comfortable unconscious. This choice, made moment by moment against the gravitational force of habit and fear, is itself the philosopher's stone, the decision to remain aware, to embrace difficulty, to seek truth regardless of cost. In this commitment lies the only authentic gold, consciousness itself, refined through ordeal into an instrument worthy of the human potential it represents.